At some point, being the smart kid went from getting gold stars on spelling tests to realizing you can't figure out how to budget for groceries without a minor panic attack. The label of gifted was supposed to guarantee success, but here we are in 2025, more burned out and broke than we expected. Researchers have found that early praise mixed with perfectionism often leads to disengagement and burnout later in life. And that plays out most clearly in our financial decisions. We'll unpack how that labeling breaks decision-making and what you can actually do to stop burning out your bank account. Because before the money problems came the identity shift. When smart became your identity. I remember sitting in class and finishing worksheets before anyone else. It wasn't that the problems were complex, it was just ordinary multiplication, but the speed gave it weight. Teachers would notice, hand me an extra sticker, or let me read quietly while the rest of the class worked. For a kid, that felt like winning a game no one had explained the rules to. That kind of recognition doesn't fade quickly. It wasn't only encouragement in the moment, it was a shaping mechanism. Without realizing it, I began to assume that my value was tied to being quick, correct, and ahead of the curve. By the time I was 10, I'd already built a mental story. If I kept being the fastest and the best, everything in life would unfold in my favor. But what happens when the labels that gave you structure don't hold up anymore? The problem is that the identity formed in those early classrooms doesn't map neatly onto adulthood. Suddenly, the sense of control you felt when handed a worksheet disappears the moment you're staring at medical bills, contracts, or rent notices. There are no gold stars, no teacher confirming you're right, and no bonus prize for being first. Real life rarely comes with a single correct choice, and that disconnect is jarring. Research backs this up. Children labeled as gifted often internalize the idea that their worth hinges on flawless performance, which means unpredictable, ambiguous adult problems land as existential threats rather than just challenges to solve. That's exactly what happens with money. The child who raced through worksheets grows into an adult who freezes at the thought of picking the right investment account. On the surface, it looks like procrastination, but really it's fear. If your identity is staked on always being correct, then every uncertain financial decision feels like a trap waiting to expose you. And once you've stalled for weeks comparing options on interest rates, the situation often gets worse. Cleverness does nothing against late fees or missed opportunities. Money doesn't wait for you to feel certain. The irony is that what feels like being responsible through endless analysis ends up costing you more. Later on, I'll show you how small tools, like automating contributions or testing low-stakes options, can short-circuit that paralysis, but at the time, none of us were prepared. The pressure runs deeper because it was wired so early. Kids praised for right answers learn to link their sense of being valued with performance before they even understand what that does long-term. It doesn't feel harmful when you're young. It feels like attention and care. But it's planting the idea that love and respect are earned only by staying ahead. That script doesn't vanish in adulthood. It mutates. Now, instead of wanting your teacher to notice, you find yourself needing co-workers, supervisors, or even your own inner critic to keep confirming that you're still the smart one. You take fewer risks, you hide small mistakes, and you overcompensate by over-preparing even when it slows you down. Every choice becomes a referendum. If this goes wrong, maybe I was never gifted after all. That's why routine financial matters, which should sit in the category of simple logistics, feel like psychological landmines. It's not about laziness, though it often gets misread that way. It's self-preservation. Avoiding a budgeting app, putting off salary negotiations, or ignoring unopened bills isn't disinterest. It's an attempt to protect an identity. Because if you try and slip up, the narrative isn't, "This is a small mistake I'll fix." It's, "I was never special, and now I have proof." That framing turns every spreadsheet or payment into a high-stakes exam. Line items and due dates warp into symbols of self-worth. And because the original training was individualistic, you alone against the worksheet. You never got practice in living with messy, shared, or unpredictable outcomes. In school, whether you got something right depended on the answer you wrote, not the whims of the economy, the timing of a medical emergency, or whether your workplace cut budgets overnight. But adult life runs on those variables. That gap means when something external hits, like one hospital bill wiping out your savings, you don't register it as bad luck. You don't say, "This was outside my control." You translate it into a personal flaw. Each uncontrollable hit feels like evidence that the identity you carried for years is cracking. And the damage to your financial resilience is compounded by that story you keep telling yourself. A lot of us went through childhood with an almost unshakable trust in our own abilities. Failures were rare and easy to rebound from. But when adulthood arrives, failures land harder because they strike at a part of you that always assumed competence guaranteed success. That sense of certainty is gone, and in its place is suspicion. If I was so gifted, why do I feel like I'm barely keeping up? It explains why something as small as an overdraft fee or a bounced rent payment can spiral weeks of doubt. It isn't just a financial inconvenience. It shakes your sense of who you are. Careers, relationships, even personal confidence slip under that same umbrella of questioning. From there grows a pattern of self-sabotage. You might spend an entire month obsessively comparing banks to find the account with the best savings rate, while missing the reality that simply not saving at all is doing the most damage. It's not that you lack numerical skills, you probably overcomprehend them. But the fear of making a wrong move paralyzes you until indecision becomes its own form of loss. And afterward, the guilt loops back into doubt. You beat yourself up for wasting time, and that judgment only makes you more hesitant when the next decision comes. What looks like overthinking is really a fragile cycle of protecting identity at the cost of progress. Even in ordinary social dynamics, this shows up. Friends might casually pick a dinner spot together, but if you're locked into proving you're always making the best choice, you can overburden it, as if the restaurant defines you. In small matters, the cost is only awkwardness. With financial responsibilities, it becomes riskier. Every recurring bill, every signed contract, every work negotiation carries disproportionate weight. Where most people accept that mistakes are part of the process, for you a single misstep feels catastrophic. That makes it harder to take steady action, which ironically is the very thing that produces consistent growth over time. Being told you were smart as a child wasn't harmful in itself. The trouble came from how tightly it framed self-definition. That framework pushed intelligence into a fragile loop. Achievement meant validation, and mistakes felt like collapse. Once finances entered that picture, with their constant ambiguity and absence of simple right answers, the loop was guaranteed to break down. The mismatch between expectations of certainty and realities left many of us stalled, earning less, and carrying quiet shame about not meeting the future we once imagined. What it produced wasn't adults lacking skill or drive. It was adults unprepared for environments where results are unpredictable and validation is invisible. Paying off debt doesn't spark public applause, setting aside money isn't noticed, and even getting a raise doesn't have the clear winner's glow that childhood achievements carried. That gap destabilizes the system the identity was built on, leaving each decision to feel heavier than it might for someone without that conditioning. And so the cycle repeats. Intelligence is still there, motivation remains, but the scaffolding you relied on no longer fits the frame of adult reality. When those mismatches pile up, they don't just threaten your budget, they lead to questioning whether you ever were who you believed as a child. That disorientation builds, and soon the problem isn't only individual choices. It's the environment you now find yourself in, surrounded by peers who throw off your expectations in entirely new ways. The crash of the middle-of-the-pack moment. There's a moment almost every former gifted kid runs into. The crash of realizing you're no longer the smartest in the room. For years you probably lived with the sense that life was a steady upward climb. Grades, awards, and small wins kept reinforcing the story. The pattern felt reliable, almost permanent. But eventually, whether in a packed lecture hall, a demanding workplace, or even a casual team meeting, you notice something shifts. Suddenly, ability alone no longer sets you apart. You're surrounded by people just as talented, and sometimes more disciplined. The straight line you relied on breaks, and for the first time, being average feels like a personal collapse instead of a neutral fact. What makes this moment hit so hard is that it doesn't just challenge what you can do, it challenges who you think you are. When the foundation of your confidence rests on outpacing everyone else, discovering that you're matched or even outperformed feels like ground slipping away. It might look ordinary from the outside, but inside, it feels like a collapse of identity. You start to wonder if all those years of praise were misplaced. If others are just as quick or capable, maybe you were never exceptional in the first place. That line of thinking wounds in ways grades or salaries alone never could, because it cuts at the core story of being the smart one. The internal fallout is subtle at first. Instead of raising your hand, you pause and let others speak. Instead of submitting a draft confidently, you revise it endlessly, waiting until it feels flawless. You tell yourself this hyper-attention is diligence, but beneath it lives a different fear. If this idea isn't perfect, people will see through me. What follows is a predictable cycle: overworking on tasks, procrastinating when the weight feels too heavy, then criticizing yourself for avoiding the work until you start over again. And this isn't just anecdotal. Clinical and educational research consistently links unhealthy perfectionism to academic burnout, stalled progress, and even underachievement in high performers. In other words, it's not that you suddenly lack intelligence. It's that the survival strategy built in childhood, proving worth through perfect results, stops working once the environment demands something different. This is how imposter syndrome finds fertile ground. Every ordinary misstep becomes proof that maybe you were never that gifted. Miss a deadline, misinterpret instructions, stumble during a presentation. What others might see as routine errors, you magnify into verdicts on your entire ability. It's not about the mistake itself, it's about what it seems to reveal. Meanwhile, you look around and assume others don't share this struggle because they appear composed. You ignore the dozens of solid things you deliver and obsess only over the slip-ups, reinforcing the suspicion that you no longer measure up. What often goes unsaid is that this isn't an intelligence problem, it's a mindset problem. Experts like Carol Dweck point to the difference between fixed and growth mindsets as crucial here. If you were raised in a fixed framework, where mistakes threaten identity because ability is seen as static, then being middle of the pack feels unbearable. By contrast, people with a growth mindset experience setbacks as learning signals, not identity threats. They frame mistakes as essential steps in development rather than proof they don't belong. That simple reframe, research shows, is often the main difference between those who adapt and those who spiral. The refusal to reframe leads to perfectionism intensifying. You work longer hours, polish projects endlessly, and second-guess decisions, believing more effort can manufacture the uniqueness you once relied on. But there's a hidden cost. Unfinished projects pile up, half-written reports sit abandoned, applications never get submitted. In workplaces, that looks like inconsistency. In education, it looks like wasted potential. The paradox is painful. Your intelligence is visible, but the fear of being exposed causes delays that erode trust. Over time, missed opportunities, deadlines, and promotions don't trace back to ability. They stem from this hesitation cycle. And as the cycle continues, the emotional toll builds. The stress of trying to embody a perfect identity leaves you exhausted, but it also changes how you interpret opportunities. A promotion no longer looks exciting. It feels like another chance to be unmasked. A project no longer looks manageable. It feels like a trap waiting to document failure. Even praise feels fragile, as though it could be revoked the instant you slip. What began as drive quietly mutates into fear, and that fear drains more energy than the actual work. Here's the overlooked reality. Being average in a new arena isn't decline, it's scale. Moving from a small pond to an ocean means the field is filled with equally strong peers. It doesn't mean you lack skill. But with gifted conditioning, you don't see it as expansion, you see it as exposure. That mindset explains why people who once led the classroom pull back in later education, or why bright new hires quietly stall when their first job demands collaboration instead of solo output. The problem isn't that they ran out of talent. It's that their sense of success hasn't updated to match the new environment. Think about how group work shifts in meaning. As a child, group assignments might have felt like dead weight. You carried the project to keep your record spotless. But later, collaboration isn't optional. Success depends on distributing strengths and relying on others. If your definition of intelligence never expanded to include integrating with peers, you read their ability as competition, not compliment. That mindset can quietly sabotage careers because advancement beyond the classroom usually requires cooperation, not outperformance. Breaking this cycle begins with accepting a hard truth. The standout identity you built in childhood doesn't map onto adult success. Continuing to measure yourself by being the fastest or most perfect only guarantees frustration. Research on performance and long-term achievement shows that adaptability, persistence, and collaboration matter more than raw quickness. Shifting into that mindset doesn't erase intelligence, it puts it back to work. The most reliable growth comes from finishing projects, learning through errors, and building trust over time. None of that thrives if your measuring stick never updates. But most people aren't told how to adjust this story. Institutions reward competition, not recalibration. That leaves you with a quiet humiliation. The real obstacle isn't knowledge or skill, it's perspective. And admitting that feels uncomfortable when you were praised for being ahead of the curve. You think you're supposed to already get it, but avoidance doesn't fix the disconnect. If anything, denial fuels the identity loop, keeping adults stuck in cycles of doubt long after their performance has earned them credibility. The crash of the middle-of-the-pack moment, then, isn't about losing intelligence. It's about facing the collapse of an outdated identity. That collapse hurts more than bad grades or missed jobs because it forces you to rethink the core story you've carried from childhood. If gifted meant always standing out, then standing among equals feels like proof of failure. The irony is that the very traits that build long-term success, resilience, flexibility, learning from missteps, aren't nurtured by always being ahead. They develop only when you can stand among equals without seeing it as defeat. That shift doesn't mean letting go of intelligence, it means using it differently. When you redefine success as contribution, completion, and learning, you loosen the grip of perfectionism. You stop holding projects hostage until they're flawless, and instead release them when they're useful. You move forward even without certainty, because progress itself confirms capability. That reframing separates those who burn out from those who eventually stabilize. It's not who scored highest as kids, it's who could rewrite the story when the old one no longer fit. And once you recognize this, the new perspective unlocks something practical. Being average in a big arena isn't a condemnation. It's evidence you've reached a bigger stage. The rules have changed, the competition is balanced, and the challenge now includes persistence, collaboration, and emotional resilience. For many, that feels unfair compared to the early days of constant wins. But acceptance beats denial. Because in the domains that decide careers and finances, learning inside a crowded field is not failure. It's the start of growth. If perfectionism and this identity trap are the problem, what actually helps? We'll show 3 microsteps that build confidence without risking your whole life savings. Burnout in your bank account. Burnout doesn't just leave you tired, it shows up in your bank balance. When your energy is low, it doesn't only affect productivity at work. It changes all the small day-to-day money choices. The nights you're too exhausted to cook, you order takeout. The week's bills pile up unopened until late fees hit. None of these decisions feel like a crisis in the moment, yet they accumulate. Research on workplace burnout shows it often increases avoidance behavior and reduces attention to routine financial tasks. In other words, the same drained state that makes it hard to start a new project at work also makes you delay something as basic as paying utilities or checking bank statements. Over time, a run of those short-term choices erodes savings faster than any single big mistake. Behind it all is decision fatigue. When you're burned out, you focus on the path of least resistance. Instead of comparing plans or setting up a proper budget, you tell yourself you'll do it later, when you can do it properly. Later rarely comes, so the budget remains undone. The opportunity costs stack up. Subscriptions renew without notice, interest charges accrue, and discounts go unused. Burnout isn't simply about being tired. It locks you into survival mode. The result is short-term relief, but long-term financial loss. The irony for those raised as gifted is that perfectionism amplifies the trap. You don't just want a budget, you want to create the perfect spreadsheet. Since that feels impossible when you're drained, you avoid it entirely, which is the very behavior that costs you the most. The same dynamic appears in career paths. Frequent job changes, often driven by burnout, can reduce earned raises and the steady continuity that leads to long-term compensation growth. A single switch can sometimes pay off, but repeatedly escaping roles because the workload feels unmanageable creates instability. Employers notice patterns, and rapid exits make advancement harder. Gaps between jobs, missed retirement contributions, and stalled promotion momentum all impose financial costs that may not be obvious year by year, but become significant over a decade. Studies of high-ability adults have documented this pattern. Career instability and underemployment are common when early promise collides with exhaustion and identity strain. Burnout might whisper that leaving is the quick fix, yet many find they reset too often to build sustainable wealth. It doesn't always look like movement, though. On the quieter end, burnout appears as paralysis. You know you should compare credit cards or set up a retirement account, but the paperwork feels impossible at the end of a draining week. So you leave it. Switching to a cheaper phone plan would save money, but the thought of researching terms feels unbearable. And so weeks extend into months. Missing 1 year of retirement contributions doesn't sound catastrophic, but finance runs on compounding. Those lost months delay growth in ways you only recognize too late. The habits of waiting for energy later accumulate as thousands of dollars missing from future stability. What looks like procrastination is in fact the visible mark of burnout's toll. Spending patterns also shift under constant fatigue. A small reward purchased online feels like a substitute for rest you never got. Delivery showing up at the doorstep tomorrow makes the week more bearable. The same is true with entertainment, subscriptions, or nights out. None inherently destructive, but their role changes. They function not as occasional treats, but as coping mechanisms. When coping becomes the pattern, the financial drain is constant. And what follows is a cycle familiar to anyone who's lived it. Spend to relieve exhaustion, feel temporary relief, then feel guilty as money runs short, only to repeat the pattern once stress returns. Burnout directs not only your energy, but your budget. Work environments can fuel this imbalance. Many burned-out professionals overcompensate by saying yes to every task, working overtime without pay, or pushing themselves to prove they're not slipping. From the outside, it looks like productivity. Financially, it's self-defeating. Hours spent on unpaid work could have gone toward training for a certification, developing a side income stream, or simply resting to make better decisions tomorrow. Overwork should build equity in your career, but when it comes without boundaries, it reinforces stagnation. You remain locked in lower value cycles, substituting constant activity for growth. Slowly, the years spent surviving deplete not only energy but professional and financial horizons. Another overlooked cost is the delay of advancement. Fatigue makes applying for the next role or negotiating a raise feel impossible. You tell yourself you'll try once the exhaustion eases, yet the easing never comes. While you wait for the right moment, peers apply, receive promotions, and stack incremental raises. The difference isn't intelligence. It's persistence powered by enough rest to follow through. The gap is invisible until you notice years of under-earning compared to colleagues who weren't necessarily more skilled, but simply consistent. Consistency matters because finance compounds not just in savings, but in career value. Regular raises, steady retirement deposits, and durable employment records pay off through momentum. Burnout disrupts momentum first. Budgets collapse each time exhaustion peaks. Automatic transfers don't build because you dip into them for temporary relief. You step away from jobs right as higher salaries become possible. From the outside, the career looks scattered. From the inside, it feels like survival. Both perspectives are true. But the financial cost measured in lost continuity dwarfs any single purchase mistake. At its core, this is why many formerly gifted adults find themselves financially behind despite decent salaries. The issue isn't lack of intelligence, but unrecognized energy loss guiding decisions. Instead of one steady path upward, life becomes a stop-and-start cycle of effort and withdrawal. Each reset carries financial weight: missed salary progression, lost compounding, delayed stability. On spreadsheets, it looks like under-earning. In lived experience, it feels like constantly running on empty. And for both, the math adds up the same way: less net worth over time. The harsh truth is that burnout and finances amplify each other in feedback loops. Exhaustion drives short-term money choices that shrink financial margins. Then financial stress heightens strain, worsening exhaustion. Bills cause sleepless nights. Sleepless nights erode performance. Weak performance deepens burnout, and the cycle accelerates. Meanwhile, spending to escape worsens cash flow, making the stress harder to solve. Outsiders may assume irresponsibility, but the experience is closer to survival mode. Short-term choices feel like the only option available, even as long-term harm accumulates. None of this means the spiral is unavoidable. Evidence shows that even very small shifts protect against the worst damage. One example supported by behavioral finance research: automation. Automatically paying one bill or transferring a reduced, fixed amount into savings removes the need for decision-making in low-energy states. Another small step is adopting a simplified budgeting habit, tracking only one category of expense rather than everything at once. These are not dramatic overhauls, they are friction reducers. Their value lies in sidestepping the fatigue barrier that blocks more elaborate plans. Even one automated transfer compounds over time, preventing the slow bleed that burnout otherwise ensures. The important recognition is that burnout's cost isn't abstract. It turns into late fees, lower salaries, missed raises, and diminished growth. You see it in the gap between what your skills could earn and what actually accrues in your account. And because intelligence makes it easy to rationalize, telling yourself you'll fix it once you're less busy, you risk ignoring real losses mounting now. Burnout is not neutral. It leaks money through avoidance, inconsistency, and coping. And unless put in check, those leaks grow into long-term setbacks that feel invisible until they are already built into your financial future. If burnout is draining your savings, one immediate step is to automate a single payment this week. Even a small amount sets a behavioral anchor that compounds. Automation won't cure exhaustion, but by protecting finances from the worst gaps, it keeps the ground from eroding under you while you recover. It marks a tangible shift from draining cycles toward stability. But money leaks are only one part of the story. The same exhaustion that keeps you from budgeting also collides with patterns built around perfectionism and avoidance in the workplace. And that's where another costly paradox emerges. Perfectionism versus procrastination at work. Perfectionism and procrastination often travel together, and nowhere is that more costly than at work. Growing up praised for always being right trained many of us into adults who hesitate to start unless we can guarantee the result will be flawless. What once looked like encouragement now operates more like a barrier. You see it in projects that stay half-finished, emails drafted but unsent, applications left in a folder, or financial decisions postponed for months. The pressure to get it right the first time becomes so heavy that starting feels riskier than waiting. And it isn't about laziness. It's about protecting the fragile identity of being the smart one. In the workplace, that tension multiplies. A report might be researched thoroughly, revised again and again, and still not delivered on schedule. A promising job application might be drafted in detail, but abandoned because the resume doesn't feel polished enough. Or you design elaborate spreadsheets comparing investment accounts, but never open the account itself. Each of these delays erases opportunities silently. You don't get told, here is what you lost the day after you put it off, but the cost builds in the background. Promotions go to visible contributors, raises lean toward consistent finishers, and savings grow for people who let imperfect choices compound over time. Meanwhile, those stuck in perfectionism feel motionless, even while working hard. This paradox is well documented. Psychologists note that perfectionism often triggers procrastination and burnout by making tasks feel unmanageable before they even begin. That pattern explains why highly capable people delay work others would see as straightforward. The fear of exposing flaws overrides the urge to act, so the safest option feels like hesitation. Unfortunately, work and money both punish hesitation severely. Every deferred submission or delayed decision compounds like interest, except in this case, the growth moves against you. On the surface, colleagues may dismiss this as overthinking. They'll suggest just hitting send, or tell you you're complicating things. And in a minimal sense, they're right. But what remains invisible to them is the childhood conditioning that built this hesitation. In school, confidence came easily because you knew the system, learn the material, deliver the right answer, collect the praise. In adult life, there is no guaranteed recognition. Decisions rarely have one perfect outcome, and the risk of being wrong feels greater when no authority figure confirms your effort mattered. That's why playing it safe, through delay, feels less like avoiding responsibility and more like self-preservation. Money magnifies the penalty. Submitting a late report might only frustrate a manager, but putting off your first retirement contribution erases years of compounding. Waiting even a couple of years to start investing creates a measurable gap decades later. Two equally skilled workers with similar salaries can end in entirely different financial positions, mostly because one accepted imperfect beginnings while the other waited for certainty that never arrived. Perfectionism dressed as caution quietly becomes one of the most expensive habits you can hold. It also wears down credibility in ways that stall careers. Managers and peers notice not just who produces sharp analysis, but who consistently completes assignments. Reliability often matters more than brilliance in leadership decisions. If colleagues can't predict when you'll deliver, or if your projects always remain in progress, opportunities shrink. Someone else, maybe less detailed but more consistent, earns trust, visibility, and advancement. Over time, perfectionism stops being seen as excellence and starts translating into unreliability. Talent by itself can't overcome this. You might bring the most thoughtful perspective in a meeting, but hesitate until the conversation shifts, leaving your best contribution unheard. Or you refine an idea endlessly, only to watch someone else step forward with a rougher draft that wins support. In both moments, procrastination strips away recognition that your intelligence could have earned, while the workplace rewards those who risk imperfection. It's not necessarily who's smarter, it's who's visible and consistent. The financial angle makes the cost clearer. Think of procrastination like a hidden charge. A missed deadline delays progress on a project, which in turn delays trust, advancement, and eventually raises. Each delay has an unseen financial impact that multiplies just like compound interest. Except now the math works against your future. Colleagues who move faster often outpace you not because they're more skilled, but because they accept imperfection as the price of progress. They climb faster because their consistency builds momentum. The roots of this cycle come back to rigid childhood lessons. If high achievement was defined by flawless answers, adulthood looks hostile because little is flawless. Managers redirect priorities without warning, markets shift with no notice, and projects reshape in ways you can't control. Waiting for the ideal conditions that guarantee safety means waiting indefinitely. The outcome is predictable. Others who simply start, even imperfectly, outperform in both credibility and financial stability, while perfectionists lose time to hesitation. Still, perfectionism isn't always destructive. The same impulse that stalls you on unfinished tasks is valuable in the right context. Careful attention to a contract protects against serious errors. Being thorough in preparing financial documents prevents costly mistakes. The instinct itself isn't the problem. It's the way it spills into every area and blocks forward movement. Blending precision with willingness to finish at good enough reverses paralysis. That's when intelligence becomes visible again, in both professional impact and personal finances. One useful shift is to see procrastination as a disguised cost. Each time you delay action, you aren't just waiting, you're paying with missed growth and diminished trust. What feels like waiting responsibly is often a silent drain, like paying interest on debt you never intended to take on. Recognizing that cost reframes the responsibility of perfection into something self-defeating. The very behavior meant to protect your reputation and wallet ends up quietly eroding both. Breaking the loop requires practicality, not perfection. A strategy like the 2-minute rule is especially effective here. The idea is simple. If a task takes less than 2 minutes, replying to a short email, filing a document, starting a transfer, do it immediately. For perfectionists, it lowers the pressure of needing a perfect long session, while building momentum through small completions. Over time, those small actions compound into credibility and financial progress. I'll share 2 more techniques later, but applying even this one can start shifting the balance from stalled potential to tangible movement. At its core, the cycle is straightforward, even if living inside it feels complicated. Childhood rewards tied intelligence to perfection. As adults, that conditioning reappears as hesitation until conditions feel flawless. But workplaces and finances thrive on one thing: completion. When actions remain unfinished, potential evaporates even if the underlying ability is strong. And while caution appears protective in the moment, without results it is indistinguishable from avoidance. The reward system of the classroom no longer exists, and waiting for that kind of certainty ensures stagnation. So much of stalled progress, at work, in finances, even in personal confidence, traces back to this single paradox. Intelligence and effort get trapped inside endless loops of polishing, avoiding, or reconsidering. The result is slower growth, lower wealth, and a daily sense of falling short without knowing why. Recognizing that hesitation as perfectionism in disguise doesn't just give it a label, it makes the hidden cost visible. And once you measure it against the gains that consistency produces, the trade-off becomes much harder to ignore. What follows is the revealing part. This problem doesn't exist only in isolation. Work doesn't happen in a vacuum. Careers, finances, and opportunities are shaped in groups. Yet for anyone raised to solve problems alone, that reality creates another mismatch with lasting costs. Why school failed to teach collaboration? Back in school, teamwork existed mostly in name. You were rewarded for figuring things out by yourself, not for bouncing ideas with your classmates. The real recognition came from being the first to raise your hand, the one who didn't need help, the student who proved independence equaled intelligence. Group projects did happen, but they often reinforced the same message. In most cases, one student carried the weight while others coasted, and if you were labeled gifted, you probably defaulted to taking the lead. Not always out of enthusiasm, but because you believed relying on others would compromise the standard you'd been praised for. That setup mattered far more than teachers admitted at the time. Educational research backs this up. Programs created for gifted students usually emphasized individual achievement, placing almost no deliberate focus on collaboration or social-emotional growth. Organizations like SUM and the Davidson Institute note that these children often miss structured opportunities to practice teamwork, leaving them skilled at producing results alone, but less prepared to integrate with others as adults. What you learned, implicitly and repeatedly, was that intelligence proved itself in independence, while leaning on others bordered on disloyalty. The problem is that adult success runs on the reverse logic. In most workplaces and financial systems, trust, cooperation, and shared networks carry more weight than the ability to complete everything solo. That mismatch can shape daily habits more than you realize. Networking, for example, is essentially applied collaboration. It's about building mutual relationships that eventually generate tangible opportunities. Yet if your brain categorizes any request for help as weakness, then every LinkedIn message or invitation for coffee feels insincere. Collaboration becomes mistranslated as dishonesty. Meanwhile, others who embrace those exchanges without guilt expand their options. It isn't about charming your way up the ladder. It's that information, mentorship, and referrals flow through relationships. People often move forward because someone upstream gave them a chance, not just because their resume was flawless. Without practice in that system, you miss entire categories of growth. Inside the office, the same pattern repeats. Adults who grew up praised as lone achievers often default to doing everything themselves because control promises consistency. If you manage every step, you set the standard. But the ceiling shows quickly. A single person's capacity maxes out early, no matter how sharp they are. Colleagues who practice dividing tasks, trusting peers, and investing in team cohesion generate results at a larger scale. Managers notice not only who delivers high-quality outputs, but also who enables others to produce, even if less brilliant individually. Promotions usually reward scalability, not isolation. And so someone with steadier collaboration skills leapfrogs past, despite having less raw ability. From the outside, it looks unfair. In reality, it's evidence that you graduated trained for a different rulebook. Money interacts with this dynamic just as strongly. Financial stability and upward mobility rarely come from isolated effort alone. They often depend on leveraging partnerships, sharing risk, and accessing information through networks. Mentors who point out pitfalls, coworkers who recommend you for roles, peers who discuss salary benchmarks between themselves. All these forms of help generate wealth. If you carry guilt at benefiting from others, you stay cut off from that flow. You keep promising to figure it out independently, build exhaustive spreadsheets, or research late into the night, never noticing that most of your peers bypass that exhaustion by simply asking trusted people what works. It isn't a violation of work ethic. It's participation in the systems that distribute opportunity. School itself cultivated the opposite habit. Tests were taken alone. Homework was graded alone. A strong paper with your name at the top earned recognition in a way group efforts never did. Collaboration during exams wasn't called practicing teamwork. It was called cheating. The framing was so strict that children absorbed it wholesale. Excel alone, and you deserve the grade. Lean on others, and you've broken the rules. That binary equation carved deep grooves into identity. It also explains why adulthood can feel disorienting, because suddenly the scorecard has flipped. Degrees celebrate collaboration across study groups. Workplaces reward those who share responsibilities. Financial success arrives fastest through partnerships and referrals. The entire system moved to prize the skill that many gifted kids were never taught. And the tension grows when you actually see it play out. You watch peers advance not because they outwork you or outthink you, but because someone vouched for them. Jobs get filled before they're advertised. Projects land with those who already have trust, not with the quiet perfectionist working alone. Promotions lean toward the person whose strength is coordination. You start to wonder why raw ability seems to count less now than introductions and conversations. But that's the reality of adult frameworks. You were prepared for the wrong kind of test. The financial outcome of this mismatch is measurable. If you avoid collaboration, you cut your access to shared salary data, mentorship, and insider insight. That's silence costs during negotiations, where people with networks advocate from stronger positions. You run a side project without feedback, while others expand quickly by partnering with someone whose skills complement their own. Isolation feels noble at first, but it caps mobility. What emerges over time isn't a crisis of intelligence, but a plateau in earnings. And those who cultivated community, sometimes with less ability overall, surpass you by multiplying resources rather than repeating isolated effort. It's easy to understand why correcting this feels unnatural. If praise throughout your formative years was tied entirely to independence, then any reliance now registers as regression. Even the vocabulary betrays you. Collaboration can sound like diluting excellence when you were raised on a metric of solitary achievement. So the instinct is to tighten control, keep every task on your desk, and double down on being self-sufficient. But every time you reenact that habit, you undercut the very systems that could accelerate your progress. The irony is sharp. Intelligence doesn't shrink when combined with others, it expands. Yet you only discover that expansion after you've released the fear of losing control. To complicate matters further, most adults don't speak openly about the relational scaffolding holding their successes together. Promotions often appear as individual merit. Managers rarely credit the influence of a mentor who coached them into the role. Businesses that thrive through strategic partnerships often present themselves as solo brilliance. That surface illusion reinforces the misunderstanding gifted kids carry forward. You assume everyone else simply worked harder, just like you try to, never seeing that most people advanced because they worked connected. The ultimate result is cycles of underachievement compared to your true capacity. Again, not because you lack discipline or insight, but because your training set you up to chase recognition through isolation. Adult systems reward collaboration instead. That's the gap, and financially it compounds. Each raise missed multiplies into diminished raises next year. Each project skipped prevents access to the extended introductions that project could have unlocked. Over the course of a career, the gap widens less from mistakes than from refusing to step into spaces that feel uncomfortable. Breaking the cycle requires a reframing of self-image. Collaboration is not a compromise, it is a multiplier. Intelligence combined with others' strengths produces leverage you can't claim alone. That recognition matters not only for personal pride, but also for financial growth. Until you practice reframing, though, the conditioning remains stubborn, pushing you to cling to independence even as it slows your advancement. One small practice can begin easing that resistance. Set a weekly ask for help goal. Once a week, reach out to a colleague, mentor, or peer for advice or feedback, even on something minor. The stakes are low, but the return is high. You normalize leaning on others in safe contexts. You strengthen relationships through genuine engagement, and you often gain information that shortcuts work or opens doors you wouldn't notice otherwise. From a financial perspective, these small relational investments compound just like savings accounts do. One helpful insight from a peer about salary averages or promotion criteria can correct years of overwork in isolation. Because adult success depends on networks, the solo achievement habit quietly blocks both mobility and long-term earnings. The path forward isn't about forced personality shifts or becoming suddenly outgoing. It's about small experiments that reset how success is measured. Beginning with even one small request for help, you retrain the instinct that independence is the only valid currency of intelligence. That habit shift matters more than abstract knowledge because it changes how opportunities reach you. And this brings us to a different kind of paralysis. The way that same rigid training can warp not only collaborations, but also your ability to act on financial decisions at all. Paralysis in money decisions. A revealing pattern shows up when money decisions move from theory to practice. You can explain compound interest, calculate loan amortization, or summarize economic models in detail. Yet the moment an actual form asks you to pick a credit card, the progress stalls. Hours disappear in browser tabs comparing cashback rewards against airline points, weighing annual fees you may never reach, and circling the same options without resolution. Eventually, the page closes and nothing gets chosen. It's not ignorance of numbers holding things back. It's how that knowledge tangles with fear, making every decision feel symbolic, as though one click carries permanent consequences for your financial future. That's the residue of how choices used to be framed. Childhood encouraged you to see problems as tests with a single correct answer. Multiple choice exams and neatly structured assignments trained attention on precision, get it right or face a red mark. Within that system, there was comfort because a clear target always existed. But adult finances don't follow test rules. They rarely have only one path forward. Choosing between credit cards, mortgages, or retirement accounts isn't about uncovering the right answer. It's about deciding among several acceptable options, each with trade-offs that can be revisited later. When money feels like another exam that grades your identity, though, uncertainty becomes unbearable and hesitation grows. On the surface, hesitation looks like caution, but more often it's a quieter form of avoidance. Bills stay unopened because you want the proper plan before paying. A retirement account never launches because you'd rather check one more review of fee structures. The budgeting software remains untouched because you can't decide which app counts as best. Time keeps moving, yet progress stalls. Each skipped choice compounds into background stress, which only makes the next choice feel heavier. The cycle reinforces itself until the whole system of personal finance feels like a never-ending multiple-choice exam you were never meant to pass. Research in behavioral economics calls this choice overload. The more options placed in front of us, the less likely we are to act at all. The problem isn't knowing too little. It's knowing so much that even reasonable imperfection feels like defeat. This hits hardest for people raised on intelligence as identity. In school, wrong answers were rare exceptions. Perfection seemed attainable, and that reinforced safety in always being right. As an adult, the scale grows. Loan agreements, insurance coverage, long-term investments, and the weight of potential mistakes feels heavier. What if the health plan excludes your doctor? What if the mortgage decision locks you into thousands more in interest? When every scenario looks like a trapdoor, it feels safer to endlessly prepare than to commit. But waiting carries its own cost: stalled investments, missed compounding, accumulating late fees. Tomorrow doesn't make the choice easier. It deepens the anxiety of having waited this long. The irony is that the same analytical brain caught in hesitation often has the exact capacity to handle long-term finance effectively. Most financial success relies on simple, steady practices. Reduce unnecessary debt, automate savings, invest in broad funds, adjust gradually. These aren't exotic secrets. The gap exists between theory and tolerance for imperfection in execution. The reflex to wait for perfect clarity delays the one thing money rewards most: time in the market and consistency. Often, the person who took a quick, imperfect step toward investing decades ago ends up far ahead of the person who endlessly researched the right product but never opened an account. Part of the paralysis comes from how permanence is misinterpreted. A car purchase feels fixed forever. An insurance contract feels locked in permanently. An investment decision seems like a lifelong commitment. But the reality is that most financial decisions allow for reevaluation. Cars can be sold, policies can be updated, portfolios can be rebalanced. These options may carry friction or small costs, but they are not binding verdicts. Still, if past experience taught you to see each choice as an exam question with no second chance, even temporary commitments look irreversible. The result is a tendency to freeze, ironically guaranteeing worse outcomes than making smaller decisions and adjusting over time. The lack of visible feedback makes this harder. In school, mistakes brought immediate correction. Miss question 3, and the red pen showed why. That feedback helped you recalibrate quickly. In finance, errors rarely appear in obvious form. Choose a card with the less efficient rewards package, and nothing dramatic happens. You just quietly misvalue each month. Without clear signals, the conditioned fear of mistakes grows stronger. The imagination fills in disaster scenarios, convincing you that a single choice might collapse your whole financial stability. With no teacher to reassure, the silence itself feels like condemnation, and inaction feels safer. But there's a quieter truth at play. Very few financial choices have a perfect answer. They have workable ranges. Almost any mainstream retirement fund will compound benefits if you consistently contribute. Almost any decent budgeting app works if you actually use it. The difference isn't in perfection, it's in beginning. Acting imperfectly, but on time, yields better outcomes than endlessly searching for flawless conditions. Consistency outweighs brilliance. Accepting that goes against the grain for people raised on reward systems that measured correctness. Settling for good enough sounds like surrender. Yet in finance, good enough actually is success. Regular deposits, restrained spending, and mindful adjustments accumulate wealth faster than the fantasy of executing a flawless strategy. Each small choice shifts the balance, and over years, those shifts matter infinitely more than the plan you never felt ready to start. What reframes the problem is seeing money as a process rather than a verdict. Processes allow iterations, mistakes correct, plans adapt, and knowledge compounds. Verdicts, like test scores, are permanent. Replacing the exam metaphor with the process metaphor reduces the fear. You stop asking which fund is flawless and start asking which fund will allow you to get started today. You stop treating debt as a moral failure and begin to treat payments as levers to adjust over time. When money is viewed as a system you work with, rather than a grade you must pass, progress starts with smaller, less intimidating actions. The shift isn't automatic. It requires humility to stop making decisions an extension of identity. As a child, flawless answers were proof of intelligence. As an adult, repeated imperfect decisions are proof of discipline. Those realities clash, and reconciling them takes intention. The practice comes in lowering the pressure of each individual decision while trusting the compound effect of many small actions over time. That's where practical experiments help. For example, open one financial account with a modest starting amount, even if you feel unprepared. Pick a savings app, or a basic investment fund, or even a credit card you've been circling forever. Commit today, or schedule it for a specific date this week. The action itself, however small, shifts the paralysis. Because the compounding effect doesn't come from accuracy, it comes from time. A starter account growing at a fair but imperfect rate produces more future value than a perfect account you've waited too long to establish. This single decision not only trims the fear, but proves through action that mistakes aren't catastrophic, they're adjustable. Each time you do this, you chip away at the story that only flawless choices maintain your worth. You build evidence that participation works even when the conditions aren't ideal. That evidence creates feedback where silence used to exist, and it converts anxiety into confidence, one choice at a time. Still, the deeper cost of hesitation isn't only financial. It eats away at how you see yourself. Each avoided action whispers that maybe you're not as capable as the smart label once suggested. And over time, the erosion of that identity carries its own heavy price. The emotional price of losing your smart identity. There's a point that arrives quietly, and it doesn't feel like a big turning moment. One day you notice that the label you carried for years, the smart one, the gifted kid, the fast learner, doesn't seem to apply anymore. Your intelligence didn't disappear, but the way others respond to it shifts. The praise slows down. Nobody claps just because you grasped an idea quickly. Nobody holds space for you the way teachers once did when your answers came first. What remains is silence, and in that silence you start asking a hard question. If you're not defined by being the smart one anymore, what are you supposed to be? It feels like losing a job you built your whole self-image around without ever realizing you were on the payroll. This change isn't easy to explain to people who never had that label stitched into their identity. For them, praise was a detail, not an anchor. For you, it became the foundation of self-worth. Remove it, and the ground feels unstable. So when intelligence no longer sets you apart, it shakes not just confidence but your direction. Suddenly, everyday choices, at work, with relationships, with money, run through the question of whether you deserve to take action at all. The consequences land in subtle ways. You stop putting yourself forward when promotions open, convincing yourself that someone else deserves them more. You sit on side hustle ideas, turning them over until the window passes. Even basic investing feels intimidating. Choosing a plain index fund seems like too much of a test when you doubt your ability to get it right. All of it traces back to the same thought. If I'm not sure I'm still that smart and capable person people used to see, then maybe taking risks only proves I'm not. That mindset seeps into day-to-day habits. You keep quiet in meetings because a wrong suggestion would feel like exposure. You measure every achievement against your childhood record of giftedness, and everything feels smaller by comparison. When finances enter the conversation, the hesitation multiplies. Asking for a raise feels too bold, as though you'd be caught pretending to be exceptional. Considering a business idea feels irresponsible, as though you'd only prove you weren't cut out for it. Each opportunity becomes a test of identity, and when identity feels fragile, it's easier to step back than to step forward. Meanwhile, life doesn't wait for you to reconcile with yourself. Deadlines still arrive, bills still demand payment, inflation still chips away at savings. Survival becomes the default mode. You tell yourself you're being safe, staying steady. But safety has a cost, too. Without growth, stability begins to erode. You watch others advance not because they're more intelligent, but because they trust themselves enough to act. Research on early educational environments shows why this hits so hard. Children raised under heavy expectations often internalize a story that their worth comes only through flawless performance. That pressure plants long-term anxiety, making setbacks feel like threats to identity instead of normal obstacles to work through. This is why rebuilding self-worth outside performance is essential. If every ounce of value comes from flawless achievement, then imperfection will always feel intolerable. But if you practice worth rooted in something steadier, decisions around money and work become lighter. Instead of approaching an investment like it's another exam, you can see it as a tool. Instead of treating a promotion like a trap, it becomes an option to try. The less self-worth is hooked to being flawless, the less every choice feels like a referendum on who you are. Changing how you relate to failure is part of that. If failure equals exposure, then of course you'll avoid it. But if failure is simply data, proof of action that teaches you the next move, then opportunities reopen. You can trial a side hustle, knowing its collapse says nothing about your identity. You can invest in small amounts, understanding that downturns are temporary, not reflections of incompetence. Taking imperfect steps forward becomes possible only once you stop interpreting each step as judgment. This renewed trust in yourself isn't about certainty. It's not a guarantee that plans always succeed. It's belief that even if things go wrong, you can adapt without falling apart. That belief fuels consistency, the real driver of financial progress. Consistency, not brilliance, builds savings, pays down debt, and grows careers. But if every decision ticks the box of identity, consistency falters because energy is drained fighting self-doubt. Stability begins the moment self-worth can withstand imperfection. It plays out in small but visible differences. Someone tied to a fragile gifted identity may hold back from asking for a raise, scared that rejection confirms mediocrity. Someone with some separation between identity and performance will ask, and even if denied, they regroup, try again, or seek other routes. The intelligence is the same. The difference is having a sturdier footing when outcomes disappoint. Choices about investing or risk-taking echo that same split. Paralysis when self-worth is entangled, cautious action when it isn't. For many, the adjustment requires unlearning the assumption that praise equals progress. In school, every achievement was visible and applauded. In adult life, progress is quiet and often unseen. No one congratulates you for months of steady saving. No one hands out stickers for finally reducing debt. But these quiet moves are weightier than anything you compiled on report cards. If validation continues to be the metric, you will miss it. To thrive financially and emotionally, you have to learn to value the small, invisible wins that compound over years. This is where a practical exercise helps. Set aside 5 minutes each day for a simple journaling prompt. Write down one thing you value about yourself that isn't tied to performance. It could be patience, kindness, honesty, or persistence. At first it may feel forced, but gradually it reshapes how identity is measured. The exercise matters for money choices too. When you think of worth in terms of character traits or values, you remove the sense that every financial decision proves or disproves intelligence. That distance lowers the weight of action. Saving, investing, or trying small ventures stop feeling like verdicts. They become steps, lighter, repeatable, less frightening. Over time, those small exercises anchor new habits. You develop tolerance for imperfection. You find that taking a risk no longer feels like gambling your identity. It feels like trying something within your control. And each time you take even a minor step, you reinforce the evidence that worth survives setbacks. That feedback makes the next step less daunting, until decisions that once felt paralyzing start to feel manageable. Once you reshape how you measure yourself, money choices change character. They're no longer symbolic battles over whether you're still exceptional. They're tools, adjustable levers you can use without fearing one mistake ruins the system. You trade the fight for recognition with a quieter confidence in showing up consistently. That turn is what allows momentum to finally return. But identity doesn't rebuild all at once. It rebuilds in movement, especially when the risks feel small enough to start. Trying for a promotion even when doubt lingers, testing a low-cost side hustle, or setting aside a modest sum to invest. Each of these small risks rebuilds faith in action. And that's the real shift. You don't work to protect a fading label. You practice trusting yourself enough to begin. What comes next is about finding those manageable steps. Big leaps sound inspiring, but feel impossible when confidence is fragile. What creates change is often the smallest risks you're willing to take, while learning that imperfection isn't fatal. Rebuilding confidence through small risks. The first step toward rebuilding trust in yourself isn't a grand reinvention. It's practicing control in smaller, deliberate ways. This section is about rebuilding confidence through small risks, the kind that feel manageable enough to attempt yet meaningful enough to create proof that you can act without collapse. Big leaps often dominate advice. Quit your job immediately, launch the business you've been dreaming about, invest large sums to prove commitment. Those scenarios sound bold in theory, but usually feel paralyzing when your self-image has already been shaken. To a perfectionist mind, they don't look like opportunities, they look like cliffs. Standing in front of them, the internal voice isn't, "What if this works?" It's, "What if I fail?" And failure becomes permanent proof I was never capable. That fear locks you into waiting, fantasizing about future change while your energy drains in place. The mistake is believing that massive moves are the only moves that matter. In reality, confidence repairs itself through accumulation, not spectacle. A series of controlled, low-stakes risks allows you to test edges without betting your entire identity. Think of it like strength training. You don't begin with the heaviest weight. You begin with something your body can carry, then add gradually. Each repetition doesn't just build muscle, it builds evidence. Small risks function the same. They let you practice acting, fail without collapse, and adjust. Over time, the brain accepts evidence that risk is not equal to disaster. Research on growth shows this gradual process is more realistic than instant transformation. Psychologists like Kazimierz Dabrowski describe development as cycles of positive disintegration. Old structures breaking down and individuals slowly reintegrating stronger through small, lived experiments. Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset aligns. Confidence grows not from one perfect decision, but from repeating actions and learning that mistakes are part of progress. Both ideas support the same conclusion. You don't need certainty before moving. You need proof from doing, even at a smaller scale. So what does small risk look like in practice? Start with something concrete and limited. If budgeting feels impossible because you think you'll fail, shift the frame. Don't design a master spreadsheet with 50 categories. For 1 week, track only your food spending. That's it. By the end, the information you've gathered is already more than you had before, and you've proven that confronting numbers doesn't destroy your stability. Micro-investing is another option. Putting $5,000 or $10,000 into markets might feel like gambling your worth. Instead, try a fractional investment app with only a few dollars. Buy a fraction of a share, almost like dropping spare change into a jar. Watching that tiny line move up or down gets you used to fluctuation. The amount is too small to harm you, but the experience conditions you. Losses no longer feel like personal collapse, just natural variations. When you build a record of surviving those shifts, larger investments stop feeling like uncharted territory. Asking for help also qualifies as a small risk. If independence once defined you, inviting someone else's contribution can feel vulnerable. Start with low stakes. Send your resume draft to a friend for a second look. Ask a colleague for advice on one specific task. The experiment isn't only about results. It's about proving your world doesn't crumble when support enters. Each time help improves the outcome, your old assumption that collaboration equals weakness loosens. And each repetition makes reaching out less intimidating in the future. Other micro-risks can be automated to remove decision fatigue. For example, set up an automatic $5 transfer into savings once a week. The amount is small enough that it doesn't create strain, but large enough to signal to your brain that you are a person who saves. Behavioral finance research shows that automation reduces avoidance because the decision doesn't need to be remade repeatedly. Over months, these tiny transfers accumulate, producing both tangible progress and a steady reminder that small actions compound. One powerful way to frame these experiments is as challenges instead of fixes. Challenges imply learning, curiosity, and play. Fixes imply flaws and punishment. So here's one challenge you can try for a week. Automate a $5 transfer today and keep it active for 7 days. Track how you feel, not how much you saved, but what happens emotionally. Does committing to something small relieve pressure? Does it reduce avoidance in other areas? Treat the experiment as data collection on your own behavior, not a test of your worth. These micro-risks matter not because of their immediate financial impact, but because each one produces evidence against the old narrative. If your past story was, "I can't take action without certainty," then every successful week of a small challenge writes a new sentence. "I can act and adjust even without certainty." Confidence reinvents itself through accumulation of these small counterexamples. Gradually, the stories you live outweigh the ones you inherited. Momentum grows through repetition. A simple budget experiment expands into tracking 2 or 3 categories. $1 invested grows to 10, then 100. A single ask for help turns into ongoing mentorship. What originally felt threatening becomes ordinary practice. And ordinary practice is exactly what translates into financial confidence. Regular saving, consistent investing, steady improvement in collaboration. The risks don't disappear, but your capacity to handle them increases with each repetition. The key is avoiding the promise of instant results. Small risks won't rebuild identity overnight, and they won't erase every trace of perfectionism. What they do is create the scaffolding for long-term change. Viewers should resist the idea of sudden transformation and instead recognize that resilience comes from stacking low-intensity experiments. Each one adds minimal strain, but builds cumulative capacity to tolerate bigger choices later. Over time, these experiments shift how you frame the relationship between identity and action. Instead of thinking, "I'll start when I feel confident," you learn that starting first generates confidence. Instead of thinking, "If I make a mistake, it proves I'm not smart," you learn that small mistakes are adjustments built into the system. That transition turns once paralyzing financial decisions into manageable processes. The anxiety doesn't vanish, but it no longer dominates. The larger paradox reveals itself when you look back. The same scenarios that once made you freeze, tracking expenses, setting up savings, starting investments, inviting support, eventually appear ordinary. They occupy less emotional bandwidth, freeing your mental energy for higher level problems. The change wasn't sudden or spectacular. It was gradual, shaped through consistent exposure to manageable risk until resilience formed. Even more, these small steps begin to reconnect your analytical strengths with practical action. By shrinking risks into visible experiments, you direct your overthinking towards something useful. Instead of circling hypotheticals forever, you analyze one slice of spending. Instead of mapping out every stock in existence, you watch how a $2 micro-investment behaves. Instead of imagining how colleagues might judge you, you run the simple experiment of asking one for input. Each iteration gives your analytical brain new evidence, and eventually a new role. That dual benefit, progress with less paralysis, is why small risks are so effective. They act as a rehearsal for larger moves, while also reframing how intelligence engages with daily life. And that reframing matters most in financial contexts. Because the truth is, the same intellectual habits that feed hesitation can also be redirected toward building stability and wealth, if used with the right structure. That brings us to the next step. Understanding how the mind that has overanalyzed itself into paralysis can also become the same mind that produces clear, strategic progress. Leveraging analytical brains for wealth building. The same analytical brain that paralyzes you can be retrained to build systems that automate growth. This is not about suppressing your tendency to analyze. It's about directing it towards structures that carry the weight for you once they are built. The urge to compare, forecast, and dissect doesn't have to disappear. It just needs a place where it produces progress instead of hesitation. That shift turns analysis from a wall into a set of rails that keeps you moving forward. Gifted thinkers already see connections and spot details others skim over. Those skills become liabilities only when they are applied to problems with no single right answer. Money decisions rarely function like school exams. There's no teacher waiting to confirm you passed. That absence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty feeds spirals. But the underlying ability, the capacity to break things down, remains valuable. The solution isn't to shrink it, but to bind it into repeatable processes. A brain that once replayed the same doubts can instead maintain systems where consistency matters more than perfection. Take budgeting. Left unchecked, your mind can spend hours comparing apps, categories, and philosophies of expense tracking. That loop delays the actual act of managing money. But if you use that same scrutiny to design one clear template, just a few recurring categories like food, housing, and transport, analysis shifts from endless questioning into a stable system. Once set, most of it can be automated. Payments flow where they should, transfers happen on schedule. You only build the framework once, and your future self benefits quietly from the structure. The energy you used to waste on deciding each month shifts into running a consistent plan you already trust. Investing works the same way. Perfectionism makes you hunt endlessly for the precise moment to enter the market, which usually means you wait too long. But if you redirect that analysis into building a process, you get something entirely different. Behavioral finance researchers emphasize tools like dollar-cost averaging, automating small regular contributions regardless of market swings, because it reduces decision pressure. This method suits analytical thinkers especially well. You get to design the setup once, adjust the details to your satisfaction, and then allow the system to run. Your brain enjoys the optimization phase, but you don't have to keep replaying the debate every month. Growth happens in the background. Risk perception is another area where analysis can shift from enemy to ally. A common trap is magnifying every risk until it feels catastrophic. The act of investing looks like gambling with disaster, or asking for a raise feels like risking your reputation. But your brain can also quantify. Instead of seeing investment as I might lose everything, detail the numbers. What happens if you invest $50? What's the historical worst-case drop for that type of fund? Those specifics shrink imagined disasters into measurable possibilities. Suddenly, what looked like ruin feels manageable. The same mental energy that once froze you now outlines safety nets. Negotiation follows a similar pattern. Avoidance often grows from imagined catastrophes, a manager angry at you, colleagues gossiping, career doors slamming. But data dissolves exaggeration. What's the legitimate pay range for your role? How often are reasonable requests rejected versus adjusted? What supporting points can you describe clearly? Analysis turns fear into preparation. You still think through every angle, but instead of using those angles to predict shame, you use them to build clarity. The conversation stops being a leap into the unknown and becomes a structured argument with evidence you gathered. The key is to recognize that analysis by itself never caused the paralysis. It was the lack of boundaries. Left open-ended, the brain loops forever. But applied to systems, budgets, contributions, negotiations, the process generates self-sustaining progress. Financial independence doesn't ask you to make flawless leaps. It asks you to build routines that keep working when you're busy, tired, or distracted. Those are the exact conditions where analytical strength delivers the most value. Practical direction helps here. A framework to start retraining looks like this. First, pick one recurring task you avoid, such as paying a bill, saving weekly, or tracking a category of spending. Second, set a small, testable parameter for 30 days. Automate a $10 monthly transfer, or log only food expenses for the month. Third, review at the end and make one adjustment. Maybe you found the amount too small to notice, so you raise it slightly. Or a category was too broad, so you refine it. Repeat. Each cycle gives your brain something it craves, feedback, while keeping the risk low enough to feel safe. This framework is just applied iteration. It uses the fact that analytical thinkers like to tinker. You've converted the habit of circling into a habit of refining. The results build slowly, but they compound. One streamlined bill payment becomes 3. A tiny transfer grows into an investment account. Logging one category of spending expands into enough visibility to plan realistically. What once drained momentum now keeps it alive. The emotional side matters as much as the numbers. Much of overthinking hurts because it feels futile, running the same questions without resolution. When your evaluations feed visible outcomes, an automated bill, a growing balance, a budget template, the same brain feels productive. You sleep easier, not because you turn the analysis off, but because its results give reassurance. Clarity replaces guessing. Instead of carrying unfinished math in your head, You let the system do it for you. That relief demonstrates directly that your intelligence is still useful. It was never about being broken, only about misdirection. One evidence-backed benefit of this system-based approach is compounding. Consistent contributions, even small ones, grow disproportionately because time multiplies them. The gifted brain that loves detail can track fees, percentages, and growth curves closely. That vigilance keeps the system efficient without needing constant reinvention. Where impulsive investors abandon plans in panic, analytical ones can lean on their preference for careful adjustment. Used correctly, each refinement improves the engine rather than derailing it. Consider also how businesses approach scaling. Products aren't perfected before reaching the public. They're tested, revised, and deployed in cycles. The same principle applies to personal finances. Your brain may resist imperfection, but when applied to iteration, perfection stops being the goal. Improvement is: draft a rough spreadsheet, refine it after use, notice patterns, adjust next month. That loop doesn't undermine intelligence, it exercises it. Systems that evolve become stronger than ones waiting endlessly for flawless launch. The irony is that the kind of thinking once framed as a liability was designed for building longevity. Systems reward attention to detail. Compounding rewards patience. Risk management rewards the ability to see multiple possibilities. Each of these traits, channeled correctly, marks the difference between fragile progress and resilient growth. Where most people get bored or careless, the analytical mind can sustain interest because there is always another variable to refine. True financial progress does not emerge from silencing thought. It emerges from giving thought the right arena. Decades of research in behavioral finance converge on this. Automating basic contributions works because it bypasses indecision. Dollar cost averaging, systematic budgeting, consistent review. These are the tools that outperform hesitation and impulse alike. Analytical people are uniquely positioned to excel at this style of structure because they enjoy calibrating details as much as implementing them. The final shift comes in how you frame intelligence itself. Instead of being smart means finding the perfect answer. The story becomes being smart means building systems that work without perfection. The test format of childhood dissolves, replaced with a process model of adulthood. Each cycle provides information. Each tool compounds steadily. And the brain you once blamed for freezing you out becomes the one designing the conditions of your financial stability. This isn't an easy transition. It feels unnatural to act without certainty, and the lure of endless research remains. But the new signal comes from results. An account, balance climbing, even slowly. Bills paid before stress compounds. Progress visible in numbers, not just in preparation. The narrative shifts from my analysis is a weakness to my analysis is the engine that sustains this. And once that shift sticks, the distinction between intelligence and wealth building narrows until they start to look like the same skill. At that point, intelligence finds a new definition, not the child's version of right answers, but the adult's version of designing tools that keep working. Wealth building turns into less about brilliance in single moments and more about consistency designed by a brain that notices detail. The very same thinking patterns that once spiraled into paralysis now stand as proof of resilience. Recognizing that reframing doesn't erase the past, but it creates permission to rethink what you've carried until now. The gifted label told you intelligence was about being flawless. The new frame shows intelligence is about building processes that outlast you. And that reframing sets up the final insight. The label itself was never the real obstacle. It was the narrow definition of what success was supposed to look like. So the real shift is simple. Stop waiting for perfect answers and start redirecting your intelligence into small, repeatable systems that keep running even when you're not thinking about them. Over time, consistency beats brilliance, and the smartest use of your analytical mind is to design habits that compound quietly in the background. You don't need to overhaul your entire life this week. Just try one micro step. Automate a $5 transfer into savings, or ask one colleague for 10 minutes of advice. Then share in the comments which step you chose, because acting, not overthinking, is what builds momentum.